On Pascal's wager, acceptance, and belief. Bill's speaking until about 10 after 11, and then we'll have a response from Blake McAllister. Big Trent is backing up his handout, and Mike is also providing a full paper for those who prefer to follow along. But I think there's only enough to maybe put one on each paper, so I'll hand these out to each paper. All right. Okay, the handout should help because we're going to be using some fairly technical details as we go along, but the paper is not super long, so I don't have any fancy presentation other than to read the paper to you. And again, hope that you'll be able to suss out what's going on in the handout. So Pascal's wager, of course, to all this is probably this familiar heuristic designed to show that believing in God exists is of greater practical value than believing that God does not exist, given the outcomes that we associate with those beliefs as they're understood at least by Pascal in his version of Christian theology. So the wager then is based fundamentally on the observation that there are only two possible factual states: God exists and God does not exist. We are to suppose also that there are two possible belief states, of course, that we might have concerning those factual states: the belief that God exists and then the belief that God does not exist. And that's supposed to yield four possible combinations of factual states and belief states. Believing God exists where God exists, believing God exists and God does not exist, believing God does not exist and God exists, and believing God does not exist and God does not exist. The relevant outcomes that are consequences of those four states are respectively eternal salvation, the finite costs associated with believing God's existence where he does not exist, eternal damnation, and the finite benefits associated with believing God does not exist where he does not exist. On the basis of that heuristic, then, Pascal concludes that it's better to believe that God exists than to believe that he does not. This is in part because the total expected value of the belief that God exists is essentially unaffected by the finite loss that one would suffer if that belief is false, given the infinite value of that belief if it's true. Moreover, it's also supposed to be obvious to us that belief in God's existence has a greater expected value than the expected value of the belief that God does not exist. This is because whatever finite positive value that believing God does not exist has, if it's true, is swamped by the negative value it has if it's false. So according to the wager, believing that God does not exist is clearly supposed to be the less valuable of the two beliefs in terms of total expected values. So in this way, Pascal argues that we ought to believe that God exists independent of epistemic grounds. But things are not so easy, of course, because he understands clearly that belief is not subject to direct voluntary control. So for purely practical reasons, he advises us to put ourselves in situations that will maximize our chances of acquiring the belief that God exists. In effect, he advises us to attempt to acquire that belief by indirect control. But the suggestion he's making raises some interesting problems, I think, that people have not really paid enough attention to. First, prior to acquiring the belief that God exists, what attitude or attitudes might we have with respect to the proposition that God exists? Second, how do those pre-belief attitudes relate to beliefs? And answering these questions has some important implications concerning voluntarism with respect to propositional attitudes and rational commitment. In this paper, the wager will be explored, and it will be argued that the kind of commitment it involves is best modeled as a form of voluntary acceptance. This is because the kind of pre-belief attitude involved in Pascal's wager is governed by standards of rationality that are different from those that apply to beliefs. Finally, the conditions under which voluntarily accepted propositions are converted into or supplemented by beliefs will also be considered. And I'm going to show that all of this, when you sort of properly reformulate the situation, has a surprising, but I think theoretically correct sort of implication. So let's sort of start with preliminaries, and we're going to reconstruct a traditional wager here in order to show basically what's wrong with it. So typical reconstruction of the wager treats it as a decision problem involving a choice about expected utility of two competing beliefs. The simplest account of this choice is understood to be one between the belief that God exists and the belief that God does not exist. This choice is then supposed to be evaluated in light of the expected outcomes determined by orthodox Christian theology, at least as Pascal construes it, as they depend on those possible factual states: God exists and God does not exist. So the wager, so understood, is supposed to involve the elements which are listed in section 1.1 there, a set of options, states, and outcomes. The elements of O and S there are straightforward. Again, that's representations of believing is P, believing is not P, and the propositions God exists and God does not exist. But we need to be clear a little bit more about what the outcomes involve. So V sub infinity is meant to represent eternal salvation, and so that's an infinite positive magnitude.
V negative infinity represents eternal damnation, and so that's an infinite negative magnitude. V alpha represents the positive value associated with having those experiences precluded by Orthodox Christian theological practice, and so it's a finite positive value. V sub minus alpha represents the value lost by failing to have those experiences precluded by Orthodox Christian theological practice, and so it's a finite negative. So then the proper way to reconstruct the wager is to see the relationships between the elements determined by counterfactuals 1 through 4. So that relates to us the different states of belief and factual states to the values that we have. So given Orthodox decision theory, the decision problem gives rise to the familiar decision matrix that many of us normally see, that's listed under 3, where we have our values associated with those states of belief and world states. The expected value of an option, then, as we should be aware, is defined by the sum of the expected values of the possible outcomes associated with each option. So in the traditional construction of the wager, we get expected values for believing that P and believing that not P as defined in point 4. So the expected value of believing that P is the sum of V sub infinity plus V sub minus alpha. And the expected value of believing not P is V sub minus infinity plus V sub alpha. Since V sub infinity and V sub minus infinity are infinite quantities, they respectively swamp V sub minus alpha and V alpha, and thus wholly determine the values of those beliefs in terms of their expectation values. Moreover, it's abundantly clear then that in this traditional construction of the wager, the expected value of believing that God exists is greater than the expected value of believing that God does not exist. In fact, it's massively greater given the values that we have. So according to Pascal, from a pragmatic perspective, we ought to adopt the belief that God exists, and this is just the familiar expectation form of Pascal's wager. But we know, of course, then that Pascal also famously argued that belief is not voluntary, and so one cannot on this basis simply choose to believe that God exists and thus make it so. In light of this recognition, he argued that the best that we can do is to attempt to indirectly bring about that belief state. This indirect approach is supposed to involve things like participating in Christian practice, mingling with believers, and reading Christian texts. But this fact about our lack of doxastic control introduces a crucial wrinkle into the traditional wager when we try to understand it as a properly formulated decision problem. Specifically, the characterization that we traditionally have wrongly assumes that the options involved are subject to direct control. In standard decision theory, the options an agent has must constitute real choices for the agent, and as Isaac Levi points out, having a choice presupposes having options. Having the option to perform some action entails having the ability to perform the action upon choosing it. Hence, having a choice presupposes having abilities to perform various actions upon choosing them. So the wager, as traditionally understood, is not really a decision problem at all. The traditional construal of the wager involved a choice or supposed choice. If it was a real decision problem, it would involve a choice between B, P, and B not P. But if it is involving a real choice or decision, it would have to be the case that the agent has the ability to perform those acts upon choosing to do so. But according to Pascal, and of course many other people who talk about doxastic voluntarism and involuntarism, these states are not subject to our direct control, so there's no decision problem here at all. The traditional wager simply is not a well-formed decision problem. So what I then set out to do is to try to reconstruct the wager in a way which satisfies our sort of desiderata about what count as real decision problems. So as a result, the actual situation in which Pascal places us is rather different from what it's been traditionally understood. The wager does not involve the acts believing that P and believing that not P as options, because those states are not up to us. Hacking puts this nicely as follows. A decision problem requires a partition of possible actions. As Pascal sees it, you either act with indifference to God or you act in such a way that you will, in due course, believe in his existence and his edicts. There is no cant in Pascal. He accepts it as a piece of human nature that belief is catching. If you go along with the pious people, give up bad habits, follow a life of holy water and sacraments, intended to stupefy one into belief, you will become a believer. Pascal is speaking to one who's unsure whether to follow this path or whether to be indifferent to the morality of the church. The two possible acts are not believe in God, do not believe in God. One cannot decide to believe in God. One can decide to act so that one will very probably come to believe in God. But Hacking does not apparently see what this actually implies about Pascal's wager. The first thing to note is that the belief states involved in the traditional construction of the wager are actually very much more like the statements God exists and God does not exist. In other words, they are better understood to be part of the set of factual states involved in the wager heuristic. What is up to us, however, is whether we accept P or not P. And in due course, we will explore what that entails about the wager. Nevertheless, as Pascal sees our situation, we cannot simply and directly choose to believe that God exists any more than we can choose that he directly exists or does not exist. So as Pascal describes the wager, this appears to amount to our simulating the life of a devout believer. And in a moment of rhetorical flourish, Pascal describes this behavior as follows. You would like to attain faith and do not know the way. You would like to cure yourself of unbelief and ask the remedy for it. Learn of those who have been bound like you and who now stake all their possessions. These are people who know the way which you would follow and who are cured of an ill which you would be cured. Follow the way by which they began, by acting as if they believed, taking the holy water, having masses said, etc. Even this will naturally make you believe and deaden your acuteness. What is crucial to see at this point then is that we can directly control this kind of commitments involving acceptance. One can directly, voluntarily, and efficaciously choose to act as if one were a believer, even though one cannot in this way choose to be a believer. So acceptance, unlike belief, is voluntary, and accepting that God exists importantly involves engaging in religious activities of the familiar sort. Pascal, of course, crucially hopes that such acceptance will lead to bona fide belief, and in due course we'll return to discussion of the connection between acceptance and belief. But first we need to see if the wager heuristic can be salvaged in light of the observation about the traditional wager and the nature of well-formed decision problems. So to begin, the standard propositional attitudes that are typically dealt with in epistemology and elsewhere are belief and knowledge, and extant interpretations of the wager incorrectly treat it as involving only belief. But it is also widely accepted that these are not the only propositional attitudes that can be had towards propositional contents, even if this appears to be an often forgotten or ignored point. We need only consider the attitudes of considering P, grasping P, supposing that P, or of wishing that P be the case, and so on, in order to see that the taxonomy of propositional attitudes is really quite diverse and complex. But the fact that there has been relatively little discussion of these other propositional attitudes is a rather serious lacuna in philosophy, and it's likely that it's given rise to tendency to overascribe belief and knowledge to agents where other propositional attitudes are really at work. So one core claim I'm going to defend here is that this is just the sort of error that's afflicted traditional attempts to formally characterize wager, sort of overuse of belief. An important task then when we're considering situations or models that involve propositional commitments is to distinguish cases involving belief from those that do not. One effective way of doing this is to distinguish commitments that involve the norm of truth from those that do not involve the norm of truth. This is, of course, because it's widely agreed that the norm of belief is truth. By distinguishing such cases, we can thereby avoid attributing inappropriate features to situations, especially with respect to judgments of rationality. This can be effectively accomplished in the case of belief by looking at instances of argument scheme 1. Our first proposition is the operant and appropriate norm in situation X involving S's attitude beta towards the proposition that P is Y. Y is not truth. Truth is the norm of belief. Therefore, S's attitude beta towards proposition P in situation X is not belief. So if we take seriously that there are true substitution instances of that argument scheme, then it is reasonable to believe that we can make sense of the idea that there are propositions that are believable, you could believe them, and even maybe plausible, but that are not actually believed. This is because there can be non-truth normed rational commitments. As we shall see, some of these commitments are pragmatic in nature, and so the aim of committing in those cases would be broadly pragmatic. Others might involve something simply based on considerations of plausibility. But once this possibility is seriously entertained, it's apparent that there are many cases of commitments to propositions that are not necessarily or reasonably understood to be beliefs, but which allows us nevertheless to achieve certain important and rational goals. And in accordance with the recognition that many commonplace propositional commitments are not beliefs, Cohen in particular usefully distinguished belief from a particular form of acceptance. And he treated the latter as voluntary and pragmatically motivated, whereas he treated the former as non-voluntary and epistemically motivated, and showed how belief and acceptance have been often conflated with serious negative implications for a number of diverse philosophical issues. In any case, given this distinction, the following argument scheme can be used to positively identify then commitments involving acceptance. And this is scheme 1B. If the operant and appropriate norm or norms in situation X involving S's attitude beta toward the proposition that P is plausibility and or pragmatics, then beta is a form of acceptance. The operant and pragmatic norms in situation X involving S's attitude beta toward the proposition that P is plausibility and or pragmatics. Therefore, S's attitude beta towards proposition P in situation X is a form of acceptance. What's important here then is that these kind of weak weaker but voluntary propositional commitments turn out to really be quite commonplace propositional attitudes, and they play roles in sort of behaviors like acting, exploring ideas, and so on. More to the point, though, it looks like a form of acceptance is what's really playing a role in the proper understanding of the wager, and the determination of the specific kind of acceptance that's actually working in the wager is going to be a crucial goal of the paper. So let's begin by looking at various concepts of acceptance in contrast to the concept of belief. And the first important distinction to make with respect to the various kinds of acceptance concerns the extent of such commitments. So as we'll understand it here, S's acceptance of P is full if and only if S's commitment to P is governed by appropriate closure principle. A modest and reasonable version of such a closure principle for acceptance is given in JBCM, there in point 5 in section 2. If one accepts that P and has a justified belief that P implies Q, then one should at least accept Q. Where S's commitment is not full in this sense, we will call such acceptance limited. The second important distinction to make among the various forms of acceptance concerns the norm that governs such cases of acceptance, and thus fixes the kind of rationality that such commitments involve. So if S's acceptance of P is strong, then S's commitment to P is such that P should be maximally plausible for S. Here, plausibility will be understood in the following sense. S is plausible for P if and only if S does not know that not P, and P does not prima facie seem to be false to S. Where S's commitment is not strong in this sense, we will call S's commitment weak, and the norm that governs such weak forms of acceptance will be understood to be pragmatic utility. So if S's acceptance of P is weak, then S's commitment to P is such that P should be maximally pragmatically justified for S. Adopting the attitude of weak acceptance towards a proposition may involve propositions that are taken to be plausible, or doing so may involve propositions that are in fact plausible despite the agents not taking them to be so, but neither of these conditions are required to weakly accept a proposition. An agent might be pragmatically entertaining a proposition that happens to be plausible, but the plausibility of that proposition may not be the rational basis on which it's being entertained. In other words, plausibility may not be among the ultimate reasons for the adoption of that proposition. So many such pragmatic commitments involve propositions, the adoption of which is not motivated by plausibility, and many commitments that aim at the adoption of plausible propositions may not be adopted for pragmatic reasons. But where we have commitments that aim at both plausibility and pragmatic utility, we have cases of what we call mixed acceptance, and in such cases, we must be clear that the rational basis for the acceptance of that proposition is both plausibility and pragmatic utility. So understood, these two important distinctions yield 6 important categories of acceptance: strong full acceptance, weak full acceptance, strong limited acceptance, weak limited acceptance, mixed full acceptance, and mixed weak acceptance. Now, of course, I think you could make further, more refined versions of each of these forms of acceptance by determining additional properties that you think they have. But for the purpose of the paper here, this coarse-grained approach to those concepts is sufficient. So to begin, let's consider the weakest form of acceptance so understood, weak limited acceptance. As it's to be understood here, weak limited acceptance is a propositional attitude like belief and knowledge, and it has the main features listed as WL1 through 7. More specific versions of Scheme 1B arguments will then allow us to discriminate truth norm commitments like belief from non-truth norm commitments like this particular form of acceptance on the basis of the norm that it does involve. In any case, the view endorsed here is that in accepting a proposition in this particularly weak and limited way, what we have is a sort of voluntary, non-evidential, but suppositional, pragmatic and contextual commitment that is really something much like trying out or using a proposition and some of its implications in some contexts. And while the account of limited acceptance offered here shares some features in common with Cohen's account, I depart from Cohen's account in terms of the closure principle that governs the kinds of acceptance I'm going to talk about today. Cohen thinks acceptance should be governed by subjective closure under material implication. That's listed, I believe, do we have that there? No, it's not on your sheet, but it's just the principle that if one accepts that P and one believes that P implies Q, then one should accept that Q. I think the closure principle is too weak. And as full acceptance is characterized here, it will be understood in terms of JBCM, again, point 5 in section 2. This is simply because subjective closure is far too subjective in closing acceptance only under what are believed to be material implications of an accepted proposition. In any case, though, Cohen's form of acceptance is still a form of weak full acceptance, since it does obey some form of closure. In any case, then, limited forms of acceptance can be distinguished from forms of full acceptance in virtue of the following general argument schemes. These are argument schemes 2b and 2a. That's listed in section 3. So in any situation, X involving S's acceptance of P, if S's commitment to P is governed by some closure principle K, then the commitment is a form of full acceptance. Then, of course, you say S's attitude beta towards P in situation C is not governed by some closure principle. This is the negative version of the argument. So that attitude is not a form of full acceptance. On the other hand, we can run the positive version of the argument. In any situation, X involving S's acceptance of P, if S's commitment to P is governed by some closure principle K, then that commitment is a form of full acceptance. We find that instantiated, and then we get a determination that we have a form of full acceptance. So we can demonstrate that a given commitment is or is not a case of full acceptance by exploring whether an agent's acceptance satisfies some appropriate closure principle. And again, I picked one that I think is the best version of that. What this allows us to do then is we're able to distinguish cases of weak acceptance from cases of strong acceptance and from mixed cases of acceptance by determining whether they involve the requirement that S's acceptance of P is motivated by considerations of plausibility, whether it's motivated by purely pragmatic motivations, or whether it's motivated by both plausibility and pragmatics. Now that's what's important then, because given this distinction, we can look at cases of strong full acceptance in the following way. And these are listed as SF 1 through 6, and this is under point 11 in section 2. Weak full acceptance can similarly be characterized in terms of WF 1 through 6, and mixed full acceptance can be characterized in terms of MF 1 through 7. What's important then about these three latter concepts, these versions of full acceptance, is that these are all cases of voluntary, complete, and total commitment, and that the completeness and totality of these attitudes is due to the fact that they're governed by a closure principle, specifically, again, as I advocate JBCM. What they are is all suppositional, non-evidential, and non-truth normed kinds of commitments, and they differ only in terms of the non-evidential norms which govern them. Strong full acceptance has plausibility as a norm, weak full acceptance has practical utility as a norm, and mixed full acceptance combines both plausibility and practical utility as norms. So let's then get back to the issue of trying to identify specifically the type of propositional commitment at work in the wager. Recall that in his insightful discussion of the wager, Hacking noted the following crucial point. The two possible acts are not believe in God and do not believe. One cannot decide to believe in God. One can decide to act so that one will very probably come to believe in God. In accordance with this observation, we can establish quite easily that the commitment involved in the wager is not belief and that it is a form of acceptance in virtue of the following arguments. Again, these are listed in section 3.1. What we get is a positive argument in favor based on the idea that the norms involved are either or pragmatic utility and plausibility. That gives us the positive determination that it's acceptance, and we get the negative determination that it's not belief because it does not involve truth as a norm. So on this basis, it should be clear that the kind of commitment involved in the wager is not belief. This is because it's not motivated by a commitment to literal truth. Rather, it is aimed at some other target, and given what Pascal says about the wager, the agent's options are best understood to involve a form of acceptance because the choice is motivated by pragmatic considerations. Moreover, we can also see that the wager cannot reasonably be taken to involve limited acceptance via the following brief consideration. If the agent's attitude involved in the wager were a form of limited acceptance, then it would not be governed by a closure principle and might also be contextually limited. But this just won't do in the case of the wager. As Pascal sees it, in wagering, the commitment we must have towards the proposition that God exists must be extensive enough to yield a high probability that such acceptance will lead to bona fide belief, and it must be sufficiently extensive to include all the implications of Christian practice. But if this acceptance were limited, it would allow for the agent to reject many of the implications of accepting Christian principles and practices, and it would not require committing to any of them in all contexts. Thus, it would seem rather unlikely that such limited acceptance of those principles would suffice to do what Pascal has in mind, and again, this is the conversion or supplementation of acceptance by belief. It is simply not reasonable to believe that half-hearted, incomplete, and contextually limited acceptance of those principles and practices will likely lead to bona fide belief. But now what we can do is, given this more nuanced understanding of the propositional attitudes at work in the wager, we can return to the issue of formally characterizing the wager in a way which properly sort of jibes with our understanding of decision problems. So the wager in all of its forms arises out of the observation that the epistemic evidence and arguments relevant to the matter of God's existence are at best inconclusive, In a more forceful and pessimistic frame of mind, Pascal himself appears to believe that they are totally ineffective and epistemically inert. For example, he says of the epistemic attempt to ground commitment to God's existence that reason can decide nothing here. So the real pragmatically motivated wager is supposed to supplant those failed attempts to epistemically justify belief in God's existence. It does so, however, by changing the standards of rationality from epistemic rationality to a form of non-epistemic rationality. And more specifically, it changes considerations from epistemic reasons to those that involve pragmatic considerations. But Pascal and those who defend the wager heuristic have not really appreciated the important implications that this actually entails. Since weak full acceptance and mixed full acceptance are both voluntary, governed by closure, do not have truth as a norm, and do have pragmatic utility as a norm, these forms of acceptance are the only real plausible candidates for the attitudes at work in a defensible form of the wager as a decision problem. Given what Pascal says, it's simply not possible that the wager involves belief, because the reasons he is trying to use to motivate the disbeliever to adopt the commitment to Christian practice are pragmatic, and it involves a real choice. Now, we're now in a position, though, to be able to properly reconstruct the wager in terms of the following elements, and this is getting the wager right, section 3.2. Our elements have to be a little bit different now. We have O prime, S prime, and C prime. The first thing to note about these elements that will be used to formulate a coherent construction of the wager as a decision problem is, importantly, that the elements in S prime are rather different from those used to construct the traditional wager. They are the following more complex compound factual states. God exists and the agent believes that he does exist. God exists and the agent believes he doesn't exist. God does not exist and the agent believes that he does exist. And God does not exist and the agent believes he does not exist. Secondly, the elements of O prime in this construction involve some form of full acceptance that's subject to direct control of the wagering agent. So understood, the problem does constitute a real decision problem. It involves a real choice. The choice between committing to P for reasons that are pragmatic and or related to plausibility. And this is just what Pascal, I think, had in mind. In this alternative construction of the wager, the elements of O prime, F prime, and S prime, O prime, C prime, and S prime, are related by the counterfactuals CF1 through 8. Again, that just ties the acceptance to the world states and then to the values that they're given as outcomes. But this decision problem gives rise to a very different and perhaps rather surprising decision matrix. And you can see it there listed as the decision matrix in point 4. Now, the values assigned as the outcomes of CF1, 3, 4, 6, 7, and 8 are straightforward, and they're not really problematic. But the values assigned as the outcomes of the consequence of CF2 and 5 are worth some additional commentary. The antecedent of counterfactual 2 describes the situation where the agent accepts that God exists, and the agent does not believe that God exists, but God exists. In this case, the agent is voluntarily committed to God's existence for practical reasons, but the agent is really in a state of disbelief about God's existence. This is the principal case that Pascal is ultimately concerned with in his discussion of the prospects for those who believe that God does not exist. However, he sees some hope here, and this is because this could be a case where the disbeliever might bring about belief through acting as if God exists. The positive outcome of this state, however, is still eternal damnation, just as in the case of CF6, if such acceptance is not actually converted into true belief. This is because the disbeliever is then merely simulating and is acting as if God exists in the possible world, or in the possible case where he exists. If the simulation is unsuccessful and does not bring about true belief, the agent still suffers eternal damnation. Such agents are ultimately not earnest believers and so are no better off than those who fail to even act as if God exists in the possible case where God exists. The antecedent of counterfactual 5 describes the situation where the agent accepts that God does not exist, the agent believes that God exists, and God exists. In this case, we have an agent who is a true believer who acts as if God does not exist in the possible situation where he exists. This could be a case where we have an agent attempting to reject God's existence by the simulation of the life of a disbeliever, despite his actually believing otherwise, in much the same sort of manner that the agent who disbelieves in the case described by the antecedent of counterfactual 2 might be attempting to bring about true belief. But since this agent is in fact a true believer, he stands to gain eternal salvation, unless his accepting that God does not exist brings about true belief, for basically the same kind of reasons that the agent in CF2 faces eternal damnation. However, when we look at the decision matrix, we have to notice something important about it. When we look at the expected values that follow for accepting that P and accepting that not P, we get the values listed in 5. The expected value of accepting that P turns out to be defined in the following way. value infinite plus value negative infinity plus value negative alpha plus value negative alpha. The expected value of accepting that not p turns out to have the value infinite plus value negative infinite plus value alpha. Since v sub infinite and v sub negative infinite are infinite quantities, they cancel out, and the values of EVAP and EVA not p are wholly determined by the values of the finitary outcomes. It should be clear that in this corrected construction of the wager as a well-formed decision problem, the expected value of A accepting that God does not exist is greater than the expected value of accepting that God exists. So from a purely pragmatic perspective, if we entertain Pascal's invitation to wager so understood, we ought to adopt accepting not p. According to the properly constructed wager, we should accept that God doesn't exist. In other words, from a purely pragmatic perspective, according to the properly constructed wager, it's irrational to behave as if God exists. However, it's clear that what Pascal really has in mind in adopting acceptance of P is that we'll thereby come to believe P, or at least that there's a very likely high chance that we're going to believe that P in accepting P. That is the unavoidable implication of his advice to the disbeliever, that they should emulate believers and follow the way by which they began, by acting as if they believed, taking the holy water, having masses said, etc. Even this will naturally make you believe and deaden your acuteness. Notice that if the principle that acceptance guarantees belief is included in the factual states that characterize the wager, then CF2 and CF4 both reduce to one of CF1 or 3, and CF5 and CF7 will reduce to one of CF6 or CF8. Effectively, a robust enough connection between accepting P and believing P will eliminate the act-state outcome combinations involving accepting P and believing that not P, and accepting that not P and believing P. If this is the case, then it would restore the result of the traditional wager because it would eliminate outcomes of CF2 and CF4. Thereby, the expected value of AP would be restored as greater than the expected value of accepting not P. And we'd get the result that it is pragmatically rational to accept that God exists in the sense that it's pragmatically rational to simulate the life of a believer. But this means that deriving the result is totally dependent on showing that the connection between acceptance and belief is sufficiently robust to drive that result. And we're now in a direct position to ask what we might say about the connection between accepting and believing, on which now the traditional wager, at least its result, critically hinges. As it turns out, what is specifically and crucially important for this attempt to recapture the traditional wager and its theistically inclined result is establishing that the probability of believing that P given accepting that P is 1. This is easy to see. It's based on the following consideration of the corrected version of the wager I just presented. Suppose that weak or mixed full acceptance of a proposition renders belief in that proposition likely with a very high probability, but not with probability 1. So the probability that an agent will believe a proposition at some later time, given that it's accepted in the weak or mixed sense at an earlier time, is close to but not equal to 1. If this is true, then relatively speaking, the outcomes in CF2, 4, 5, and 7 will be very likely scenarios, and CF1, 3, 6, and 8 will be very unlikely scenarios, or will be very likely that they're the likely ones. But given the nature of the outcomes themselves, this would not change the outcome that the expected value of accepting that not P is greater than the expected value of accepting the P. This is because while considerations of probability can impact the expected utility values of outcomes involving finite expected values, they have no impact on the expected utility values of outcomes involving infinite values. The infinitary nature of these magnitudes swamps any non-unitary probability. For example, the value associated with CF5 is still V sub infinity, even if that outcome is only infinitesimally probable, due to the fact that acceptance almost always leads to belief. This is because the expected value of accepting not P in that case is just the product of the probability that the outcome in question will come about and the magnitude of the expected value of that outcome of accepting not P in the world state where one believes P and God exists. So the expected value of accepting not P in this case is still V sub infinity. And the same thing goes for all of the values associated with counterfactuals 1, 2, 5, and 6. Since all of this is the case, we still get the cancellation of the infinitary outcomes for both accepting that P and accepting not P in the calculation of the total expected values for those options. This makes the expected value of accepting that P dependent only on outcomes of CF3 and CF4, and the expected values of accepting not P dependent only on the outcomes of CF7 and 8. As should then be clear, it's still the case that the expected value of accepting not P is greater than that of accepting P. So unless the conditional probability of B given P is 1, we still get the surprising result that the corrected and well-formed version of the wager shows that from a practical perspective, we should not simulate the life of a believer. Now, are there any good reasons to suppose that the conditional probability of believing that P, given that you accept P, is 1? And I think there are basically 4 obvious positions you might take on the matter, and they involve treating the connection between accepting and believing as either a strong modal connection, a matter of natural law, a logical implication, or a brute unitary conditional probability. So quickly, let's look at these 4 options and see if there's any hope here for restoring the wager. So let's look at the case of a strong modal connection. Is it reasonable to suppose that there's a strong modal tie between accepting and believing that will entail that the conditional probability of B given A is 1? First, clearly, if it's necessarily the case that if one accepts that P, then one will believe that P, then you get that result. Then the conditional probability will be 1. But it doesn't seem to be the case that it's true that necessarily if one accepts that P, one will believe that P. It's far too strong to be even remotely plausible, and there's nothing at all impossible about the existence of cases where an agent has the attitudes accepting P and believing that not P. There are simply cases where simulating belief in P for practical reasons does not successfully result in later believing that P. And there's nothing at all contradictory about such cases. Moreover, surely part of the gravity that Pascal attaches to the wager is that there's no sure thing that this kind of acceptance will lead to belief, certainly not as a matter of alethic necessity. He seems to be acutely aware that actual failure in this regard is a real possibility, and that our efforts at simulation of belief thus require work and earnest hope that our efforts will bring about belief and that they're successful. Otherwise, we face eternal damnation. Second, is it reasonable to believe that there's a strong nomological tie between accepting and believing that would entail that the conditional probability of B given A is 1? To this end, suppose we adopt something like the necessitarian view of laws, and that we believe that A nomologically necessitates B. If that were the case, then the probability of believing, given that we accept, would be 1 in the actual world, and in those possible worlds characterized by the same laws. But is it reasonable to suppose that an agent's having the attitudes accepting that P and believing that not P is nomologically impossible? Surely it's not, and it's simply not reasonable to suppose that cases involving accepting that P and believing not P are precluded by the laws of nature in the actual world or in close possible worlds characterized by those same laws. This is simply because there are, in fact, actual cases where simulating belief in P does not successfully result in later actually believing that P. Consider, for example, any number of cases involving immersive acting, pretending, or indoctrination, where the agent accepts a set of propositions and their implications for some period of time, but does not ultimately come to believe them. So it's not reasonable to suppose that acceptance will lead to belief as a matter of nomological necessity, and there's no reason on that basis to believe that the conditional probability of believing given acceptance is 1. Suppose then that we were to adopt the weaker yet view that accepting that P materially implies believing that P. If this implication were true at the real, actual world as a matter of mere regularity, then it would also be the case that the probability of believing given accepting would be 1 at the actual world. But again, this is totally implausible because there are clearly actual cases where simulating belief in a proposition does not lead to actual belief in the proposition at a later time. So this suggestion fares no better than the 2 stronger alternatives we've already considered. Finally, let us consider the brute probability itself. Is there reason to believe that the conditional probability of believing a proposition given its acceptance is 1? Certainly the answer, again, is no, and the claim is false for exactly the same sort of reasons we've just examined in the context of stronger attempts to yield the result. It simply isn't true that acceptance always leads to subsequent belief. The conditional probability of believing, given that one accepts a proposition, is not 1. The real problem with the wager, then, however, is that given any interpretation of the connection between acceptance and belief, when the wager is properly rendered as a decision problem involving voluntary acceptance, it favors accepting not P as a matter of pragmatic rationality. This is because there's no plausible way to justify the claim that the probability of believing given that a proposition given one accepts it is 1, and this is necessary for recapturing the results of the original but ill-formed version of the wager. As a result, when the wager is properly constructed as a well-formed decision problem involving acceptance rather than belief, the expected value of accepting not P is greater than the expected value of accepting P. So if pragmatic considerations are all we have to go on, then we should not accept Christian practice. We should behave as if the proposition that God exists is false. That is really what prudence actually advises.